Chris, do we wait 4 more minutes or what?
I'm starting to record.
You're starting to record?
We should get in the habit of showing up at noon.
Okay, and we'll just leave the door open and see who wanders in, what other victims we may have amongst us. Well, thanks to the Monthly Monday for inviting me to give a talk about the early history of Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. And thanks, I always like to thank Timothy Hopkins for making all of this possible, right? So I've been working on the history of Hopkins Seaside Laboratory pretty much the time I arrived into the library position as branch library specialist. I just started trying to figure out a little bit more of the history of why Stanford University would put a seaside laboratory here in Pacific Grove, California. Right? What was the reason? Why didn't they put it at San Francisco Bay? Why doesn't it at Half Moon Bay? It's much closer than coming down here to Pacific Grove. And why a seaside laboratory at all? What's the whole idea of seaside laboratories in the history of America? And part of that gets told in this story that I'm about to tell you. Okay? So with that, we'll go to the next slide. This is the first building, right? 1892. This is the first set of cohorts. First students at Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. Notice there are no cantilevers on this building. You're going to see cantilevers in a few more slides. There are 96 windows associated with this building. It has no foundation. It has running water and fresh water and running seawater. Okay, if you don't take everything away with you today, you can go online to seaside.stanford.edu. There's chapters there, draft chapters of this story. Guaranteed to put you to sleep in 15 minutes, all right? So if you can't sleep, go there, download one. Your insomnia will be taken care of. So we're going to start with Louis Agassiz, right? And Louis Agassiz is a comparative zoologist who comes from Europe. And he arrives to America in 1846, uniquely positioned to become a leader in American scientists. He's at Harvard University from 1848 to 1873. And he's savvy to the influential role that media coverage plays, right? Provided. Now, we're going to start with Louis for a particular reason. And it's going to relate to David Starr Jordan and establishing of seaside laboratories. So Louis arrives, and he's a comparative zoologist, but he needs to put together a collection of objects of nature. He wants a museum, okay? So Harvard University gives him a small shack on Charles River to start filling up. He fills that up. Then they give him some more space at Harvard University. He fills that up. He wants more. Louis Agassiz is a big name that most of us are not really familiar with. Louis Agassiz is to natural history and natural history museums what Jacques Cousteau is to the oceans, what Carl Sagan is to the cosmos, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, so this is Louis. Louis's big name. Everybody knows who Louis is. Louis finally gets his building built, the Museum of Comparative Zoology, Harvard University, 1859. But Louis not satisfied. Louis is trying to get in the teaching of hands-on learning, observational studies into the sciences. And he doesn't want it just at the university level. He wants it all the way down. He dislikes rote learning by memorization. He wants hands-on learning, observational studies at the grade school and high school level. So, it's 1859. He's done with his museum. Okay, so Louis' motto is study nature, not books, right? And the method of study, like I said, Agassiz encouraged was direct hands-on approach to learning. Well, what happens in 1872, I believe it is Penikese Island. This is a small, isolated island about 30 miles off the coast of Massachusetts. And Louis is going to hold a summer school of science. This is America's first summer school of science, right? And Louis hand selects 44 students. 26 are men and 18 are women. This is going to be a watershed moment for women in natural history because Louis is savvy to using the media. And this is one of the reasons. So Louis invites these newspaper writers, right, the journalists, to come and visit the Seaside laboratory on Pennakees Island while it's being conducted, and they write up stories. They put them in the newspaper. Anybody have any idea how many newspapers there are in America in 1873, 1874? There's like 2,000 newspapers. The country is just swamped with newspapers. So when something as big as what Louis does gets in the newspaper, it just goes. And it travels from one coast to another. So this is America's first summer school of science. It's on Pennakees Island. It's the Anderson School of Natural History. So it was funded by Mr. Anderson, right? So it's the most remote of the Elizabeth Islands off the coast of Massachusetts, Buzzards Bay, 25 miles southeast of Newport, Rhode Island. It would last only 2 years. Louis passes away that very year. His son Alexander takes it on for the second year, right? There weren't enough funders to continue it. Alexander Agassiz becomes a famous oceanographer. That's who the Agassiz building here is named after. Just a little sideline. Okay, these are 3 sketches from Frank Lewis, a journal, August 1873. These type of sketches would wind up in the national newspaper coverage. Like I say, it's a watershed moment because they recognize that both men and women are introduced, taken to Louis' first summer school of science, and if they recognize that women can be on par with their men. But Louis also invites normal school teachers. That's one of his big purposes for that hand selected. He wants to train teachers, normal school instructors, who are going to go back to train school teachers in the proper method of study of nature, right? Natural history, hands-on observational studies. So that 44 cohorts of students, 6 of them go on to establish Seaside laboratories in America, right? 3 of them are in existence today. Marine Biological Laboratory, Woods Hole, and Cold Springs Harbor, and our own Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. Because of those 44 cohorts of students, one of them is David Starr Jordan, right? But notice I have Chautauqua, the Pacific Coast Assembly of the Chautauqua Literary and Science Circle, as among what I now consider one of those Seaside laboratories in 1880. The Chautauqua here in Pacific Grove, right? It's a Chautauqua Assembly. It takes place for 2 weeks out of the year. Chautauqua is an opportunity to get a college education that was open to the masses. This was the Phoenix School that's online today of its time. You would get your material in the mail. You would sit in a Chautauqua circle with the other predominantly ladies of the community, or you could sit alone, work through your material. After 4 years, you would get a Chautauqua program or a diploma, which was well respected. During the summer times, you would actually have an opportunity, if there was assembly in your area, to come spend 2 weeks at the Chautauqua Assembly. So we have one here in Pacific Grove, California, right, for 2 weeks. We had instructors from Cal State Normal School, San Jose, which is San Jose State University, come and teach at this. We had UC Berkeley come teach at this. We had University of the Pacific come teach at this. When Stanford finally got established in 1892, they would open the door of the Hopkins Seaside Laboratory to the Chautauqua schools, the participants who would come to the Chautauqua for the 2 weeks. So this is the first Chautauqua program. This is the first summer school, what I call west of the Mississippi. It's 1880, and I can find nothing anywhere else like it on the West Coast. Nothing like it at any Chautauqua in the United States. And they emphasize this is special opportunities for the study of natural history. John Muir's been invited. Muir will not show up. He's invited 3 or 4 times. The reason, because John Muir is deathly afraid of public speaking. Right? Totally afraid of public speaking. You can find out all about this at chautauqua.stanford.edu. There's 10 chapters up there. Again, you'll put you right to sleep. Right? This emphasis does not go on for 1 or 2 years. It starts in 1880 with marine botany, marine zoology with a microscope, and conchology. 2 years later, marine or botany takes place. This emphasis continues through 1915. 35 years in Pacific Grove, 2 weeks out of the year. This is the program for the 1892 Chautauqua program. They've got general botany, marine zoology with a microscope, conchology, entomology, taught by the doctor who established the entomology department at UC Berkeley, chemistry, modern languages, ancient languages, literature, and department of art. And there's more. This is a happening joint in the summertime. And the emphasis is predominantly women, predominantly school teachers coming to participate in that Chautauqua program that they're working for their Chautauqua diplomas on. So what comes out of that Chautauqua program, right? Well, this is one of them. 1883, they call for a museum for their objects of nature, just like Louis Agassiz here in Pacific Grove. And we have it to this very day. They started gathering this collection of objects of natures in Chautauqua Hall. They were provided a little bit of space. A few years later, they're provided a museum, and they start gathering their objects of nature. This isn't the only Chautauqua, right? There's other Chautauqua assemblies taking place, but this is a very, very popular and very, very unique. They do teach some courses of marine biology down in Southern California during this time. But this one, the Chautauqua Assembly in Pacific Grove, is quite unique. Like I say, if you're bored to death, can't sleep, 3 o'clock in the morning, chautauqua.stanford.edu, the whole story's there. But now we're going to go back on to where we want to be, right? Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. The history of why did Hopkins establish, or Stanford establish a Seaside Laboratory here, right? So David Starr Jordan comes in 1891 to California to become president of Stanford University. He participates in Chautauqua assemblies, as many as I've seen, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 97, 98. That's just here. Jordan would visit many of those other Chautauqua assemblies because they're opportunities to recruit students for his new university. 1891, he takes the train down. He's going to do his first public lecture in California to the Chautauqua Assembly here in Pacific Grove. He gets off the train and says to himself, oh my God, I've been to Pennakees. I've talked about Louis Agassiz my whole life, hands-on observation. They're already teaching marine botany, marine zoology, conchology. I can be down here in 3 hours because the train runs right down here. I would like a Seaside Laboratory here, right? So that's part of the history of why we selected. The other important thing is this is such a unique area for marine science. The diversity here. And Agassiz is just blown away by the diversity. So 1889, the Southern Pacific Rail Service extended all the way to Pacific Grove. It's 3 more years before we even get here. And you can already get off the tracks at Lover's Point. Timothy Hopkins, the adopted son of Mark, treasurer of the Southern Pacific Railroad. He's going to be the benefactor for helping to build the first couple buildings, and also the city of Pacific Grove is going to contribute to the buildings. And more importantly, the Southern Pacific Railroad owns all this property. So it's easy for Timothy Hopkins to donate 5 or 10 acres for Hopkins Seaside Laboratory to be established. So the Southern Pacific Railroad, with the encouragement of Timothy Hopkins, says, yes, provide this property. So here we are, it's 1892, and again, we're nominally associated is the words that they use in much of the language for the first 10 or so years when it's communicating Hopkins Seaside Laboratory about Stanford. Notice the cantilevers have arrived, right? The first building had no cantilevers. What happened? A great big winter storm almost blew the building over. So they had to put cantilevers up to hold it. Those cantilevers would stay in place for the next 25 years. All right. So there's 2 buildings. 2 years later, it's 1994. There's 2 buildings. Both have water towers, fresh water and fresh seawater being pumped in. No electricity until 1911. Offer courses to students in the summer. Visiting scientists year-round. So there's visiting scientist room on the top of these buildings, and the laboratories are down below. They thought they would only have visiting scientists during the summertime, but they got so many requests, and people just wanted to keep coming. So the visiting scientists wound up coming almost all year long. Another picture of Hopkins and Lover's Point. Two buildings. The first director is C.H. Gilbert, professor of zoology. He's one of David Starr Jordan's graduate students from Indiana. He contributed in one Chautauqua. O.P. Jenkins, professor of physiology and histology, director of Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. He contributed to a few more Chautauqua assemblies. 1892, 1893, 1898. These are just a quick, brief overview of the courses that would be offered during the summers. Notice General Ornithology, 1901. Marine Vertebrates, 1908. General Morphology of Algae, 1910. So as years progressed, the science progressed. The first year was marine botany and marine zoology. The first courses offered at any of those early seaside laboratories. But very quickly they get into histology. Here are the attendees. The take-home message on this is we're nominally associated from Stanford University. Anybody can come to attend, right? So it's high school students, preparatory school students, normal school students, colleges and university students, Mills College, Berkeley, public school teachers, high school teachers, principals and superintendents, professors and instructors of normal schools. The door is open. Okay, George Clinton Price, professor of zoology, participated in 16 of the 23 regular sessions of Hopkins Seaside. And I know he's contributed to the Chautauqua Assembly of 1903. But what we get from Price is a letter that's in the scrapbook that says those two previous guys, Gilbert and Jenkins, he says, those guys, they're around for the first 3 or 4 years and then they're never ever down here again. It's me and these other associate professors that keep Hopkins Seaside Laboratory going for the next 20 years. He participates in 16 of the 23 years of regular sessions, right, at Hopkins Seaside, coming down, instructing. Frank McFarland comes down. He participates in 13 of the 23 years of regular sessions of Hopkins Seaside. Anybody notice 23 years, not 25 years? Something happens in 1903, 1904. Not sure what it is, but they didn't teach courses those 2 years. Harold Heath participated in 10 of the 23 regular sessions at Hopkins Seaside. He contributed to several assemblies, 1994, 95, 98. Okay, so here's Hopkins Seaside Laboratory, class of 94, 17 women and 19 men. So we're almost equal, men and women. Lots of women coming here. 1907, class 17 women, 21 men. Note the sign, Hopkins Seaside Laboratory on the top there. Note the sign, Hopkins Seaside Laboratory on the top there. Note there's no sign on Hopkins Seaside Laboratory right there. Right? What happened? It's 1908. We still got equal men and women coming down, but somebody took the sign off. Timothy Hopkins asked that his name be taken off Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. He was frustrated, according to Dr. Price, with David Starr Jordan, who was using all the money that the trustee, Timothy Hopkins, was giving to the university on collecting bottles and law books. The name would not come back until we come back over here in 1917. Actually, 1916, 1917. Okay, so now we've talked about several of the professors, but we've talked about now is Clara S Stoltenberg. Now, how many people have heard of Clara Stoltenberg? Don't feel bad. I never did either until I got into this story, right? So this is class of 1906, 3 men and 4 women, including Clara. So Clara, here she is with O.P. Jenkins and Frank Mason McFarland. 1892, attended Stanford as a student education. Soon her interest centered in biological sciences, mainly physiology and histology, graduating with a bachelor's degree in 96, master's in 97. She becomes a professor of anatomy at Stanford University, one of only 2 women to attain the rank of full professorships during the university's first 4 decades. She participates in 7 of the 23 years of the early sessions of Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. She's an instructor, 1906, 1907, 1908. Then we have lots of visitors, very interesting visitors, and I'm just going to give you a handful of who came through here, right? So Nettie Stevens is really famous. She was on Google about 2 months ago, right? On one of those daily, Google signage, like who's this, who's famous. She had come to Stanford University and did her bachelor's in '89 and master's in 1900. Then went to Meyer College in 1903. She's famous for the discovery of the sex chromosomes, XY. So you can see she attended in 97, 98 as a student, and then came back and occupied one of those investigators' rooms. 1909, or 1899, 1900, 1901, and 1911. Ida Hyde comes here. She's a professor of physiology, inventor of the microelectrode for stimulating cells. She occupies a room in 1907. Cornelia Clapp. Anybody familiar with Cornelia Clapp? She's one of David Starr Jordan's vagabonds. Traveling vagabonds, right? So she and a number of other students would travel with David Starr Jordan as they toured the Southwest or the Southeast, Kentucky and Indiana and Tennessee. Then they were surveying the rivers for fishes. She's an American zoologist specializing in marine biology. Clapp was one of the first women ever to receive a PhD from American University, earned 2 doctorates, the first Syracuse University and the second from the University of Chicago. Right? So she's a real big name at Mount Holyoke College. So huge, she's got a building named after her. Right? So she was here. Margaret Wythe was here. University of California, Berkeley is where she gets her master's degree. She attended 93, 94, 98. And then she became assistant with Joseph Grinnell, curator of birds, Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, UC Berkeley. There's Grinnell. That's going to be her supervisor at the museum. He attended Stanford with a master's in zoology, PhD 1913 in zoology. He's assistant during the summers of 1900, instructor 1901, 1902. That's that ornithology class that's being taught down here. First director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley from the museum's inception, 1908 until 1939. These are John Muir's ladies professors, right? This is Cal State Normal School, San Jose. These were the women that Muir would actually come down and visit while he's visiting his very good friend there, Principal C.H. Allen. And they would hike up to Mount Hamilton with Muir. Muir was very comfortable with small groups like this, but he was never good in terms of a large lecture. This is Lucy M. Washburn, right? She's got one heck of a story behind her, as you can tell. She was an instructor at the Cal State Normal School, San Jose. A pioneering teacher of the California State Normal School, San Jose for 33 years. Lucy recognized as a leader in early California education. She attended Hopkins Seaside 92 and 95. Now you would think that maybe they'd have a building after her, right? Right? Lucy M. Washburn Hall, Cal State Normal School, San Jose. Very few people know who Lucy M. Washburn is over at Cal State Normal School, San Jose. But I was able to gather all that story up and put a nice little biography about her together. This is Mary Edie Norton, right? She's the curator over at the Natural History Museum in Pacific Grove, right? So she attends the programs over at Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. Reinhard P. Cowles. Now, Reinhard, as you go through, you want to find out about all these people who attended the Seaside Laboratory. So you find their names and you do a little search. And Reinhard P. Cowles comes up for me. So he's at Hopkins Seaside Lab 97 and 99. He says he graduates from Stanford, and then he goes to Johns Hopkins University, 1904. He turns out to be the advisor, right, for Rachel Carson's master's degree at Johns Hopkins University. Rachel Carson's having a heck of a time with her master's degree. She's not getting into a project that's yielding any scientific results. Reinhard P. Kahl takes him under her under his wing, and directs her, gets her off running, finishes up. So that's our little history of Carson and Reinhard P. Kahl's connection. Then there's Elmer Higgins, right? So that's our first connection with Rachel Carson. Then we have this other one, which is Elmer Higgins. And this is Elmer. So he's at Stanford University, bachelor's in 1919. Then he's at University of Southern California, 1923. He's staff at Cal State Fisheries Laboratory. Within this picture is Thompson and Frances Clark, if anybody's familiar with the name Frances Clark. She's a very famous researcher, fisheries researcher, that does the sardine fishery research here in the Monterey Bay. So Elmer's goes on from being at the California State Fisheries Laboratory, and he becomes the division chief for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, which is Fish and Wildlife Services, in 1939. He hires Rachel Carson for a temporary assignment to write a series of 52 short scripts for radio programs of marine life that the Bureau was preparing. Higgins then asked her to write an educational brochure for the Bureau. That result, which was too literary, that was his problem with it, suggested Carson should submit the text to the Atlantic magazine. The Atlantic picks it up, takes it, and Rachel finds this other outlet for her career, and this sets everything's in pace for Rachel's career of writing. There's a picture of Frances Clark. She gets Stanford University, 1918. She's there with Elmer Higgins. They probably take the same zoology courses. Pioneer in marine conservation, warning sardines were being overfished. Hopkins Seaside Laboratory, 1907, 22 women, 24 men. So you're still seeing it's continually pretty much 50-50 men and women. Jacques Lerb, the Jacques Lerb Laboratory that we have here, right? Jacques Lerb comes visit. He's a visiting scientist at Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. Maintained an investigator's room during the winters of 1898 and 1900. Okay, then in 1902, Lerb was recruited by the University of California, Berkeley to fill a similar chair that he held at the University of Chicago. And then this guy named Hertzstein, who's a big money developer at Stanford or up at the Bay Area, purchases a piece of property right next door and builds Lerb a laboratory. So he donates that property to UC Berkeley. This is the Hertzstein Laboratory, one of the very few pictures that we have of it, basically at the foot of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I like to think of it as at the door where the Monterey Bay Aquarium is. So that property was owned by UC Berkeley. The story goes, the Chinese fishing village comes along as it burns down in 1906. Then the railroad company offers this piece of property here to UC Berkeley. They do not move on it, take any opportunity on it for 10 years. That's when the switch comes from Hopkins Seaside to Hopkins Marine. A transfer happens. That year they had rescinded the offer to UC Berkeley, but there's still this property over at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, owned by UC Berkeley. They eventually sell that property, UC Berkeley does, to Hovden. And then UC Berkeley's out of here completely. But they had an opportunity for both pieces of property. This is Ray Lyman Wilbur, third president of Stanford University. He's going to be very influential of why Hopkins Marine Station is here today. He comes down 1896. So a little bit on Ray Lyman, right? Third president of Stanford, chancellor from 43 to 49, the 31st United States Secretary of the Interior under Hoover. He's good friends with Hoover. In my collecting work, the Seaside Laboratory, one of my best friends was Tok, the Chinese fisherman near Monterey. He's real good friends with Tuck Lee, right? Tuck Lee's collecting for this gentleman named Bashford Dean. He's getting hagfish embryos, and everybody at this time wants hagfish embryos to understand early developmental biology of fishes. There's Tuck Lee, picture of Tuck Lee. Tuck Lee's house, basically, I think I have the next slide, was right here. I like to consider us in Tuck Lee's living room. Tuck Lee was the go-to fisherman. He's American-born. He probably knows about 4 or 5 different languages, and he is the go-to person if you want hagfish embryos, right? And these people want hagfish embryos. The scientists do. Dauphin comes down, a gentleman by the name of Dauphin. Ayers comes down, and then this gentleman by the name of Bashford Dean. Bashford Dean is a very interesting gentleman, right? As you can tell. Right, he's an American zoologist specializing in ichthyology and at the same time an expert in medieval armor. He's the only person to have concurrent positions at the American Museum of Natural History and Metropolitan Museum of Art. He visited Hopkins in 96 and 99, and he hires Tuck Lee to get those hagfish embryos. Chris Lowe had a postdoc, or a potential postdoc, come visit about a week ago, and he came walking into the laboratory, into the library, and we started talking about early history, and he was totally into hagfish embryos, and he'd been doing some of the early or recent research on hagfish embryos using Bashford Dean's collection of hagfish embryos that Tuck Lee had gathered for him. They're at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, Harvard University, that was established by Louis Agassiz. See how it just keeps going full circle around and around? They're a picture of those hagfish embryos. There's the last year, Hopkins Seaside Laboratory, 1917, 10 women, 17 men. And here we are, we're headed over this way now, right? So it's Hopkins Range Station, the construction starts in September of 1917. We're going to have one building for about 10 years. There's another picture from the intertidal zone. Here it is, 1918. This is the first summer where courses are taught. And I'm going to leave it right there. That's 35 minutes. That's not too bad. Any questions? Comments? Thoughts?
How is a Lurb Hall named for a UC Berkeley professor?
And how is Agassiz building named for Alexander? So when they have to name this building Alexander, they wanted to name that building after a Stanford professor, but there was, disagreement on who that would be. And there had begun to be oceanography being conducted in that building. Bigelow had come down and conducted a summer course on oceanography. And Cal Fish and Game had moved in there. And they started doing the hydrobiological survey, which one of the professors was in charge of. So my understanding recently was that Alexander Agassiz was the mentor for Bigelow. So maybe that's why we got that building named Agassiz. But why do we get it named after Jacques Lurb, right? The funding had come for Jacques Lurb from the foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. Ray Lyman Wilbur is very good friends. First, I'm going to tell you the story about Ray Lyman. He's very good friends with the third president of Stanford University. Timothy Hopkins and Ray Lyman Wilbur, it's like a father-son relationship. So when the deal to move over here is negotiated, Ray Lyman Wilbur asked Timothy Hopkins if we could please put your name back on the station. And he agrees to that, says, yes, that's fine with me. That probably sets up the endowment that's going to come as well. So that takes care of that little story. But the Lurb building, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, Ray Lyman Wilbur sits on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, They provide $100,000 for that building. When it comes time to name that building, they asked Ray Lyman, do you feel it would be okay for us to name it after Jacques Lerbe? Ray Lyman's summers were spent as an assistant to Jacques Lerbe at Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. So he was more than delighted. He'd gone on to be a medical doctor and very closely associated with Stanford Hospital. This is Ray Lyman Wilbur. So Ray Lyman at that period of time understood the importance of hands-on learning, observation study to be introduced to the next cohort of doctors, medical doctors.
At that time, they were naming things after really famous scientists, not funders. You know, Agassiz was the famous oceanographer. Lerbe was the president of Rockefeller Center then, so he was one of the big names in physiology, and the Lerbe building was built for physiology, so it was perfect.
I think you're right, because when you think about it, if you go to MBL and Woods Hole,
Yeah,
you've
exactly.
got the same buildings.
Yep.
You got Lerbe, you've got Agassiz, you've got Bigelow too.
Yep.
So remember that what's going on is we have this ocean physiology community of big people who are on both coasts.
Yep.
Somehow,
That could have been the Bigelow building just as well, I think, because he was here.
it's the oceanographer Bigelow, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yep, the oceanographer Bigelow comes out for that one summer, teaches the summer coach, and he encourages Cal Fish and Game to work with Stanford University to start doing the sardines.
I think what's amazing is then this MBL to Stanford connection that I get mixed up which came first, of course, but it's MBL that came before this one. And so you can see this incredible care that people had to want to make sure that this happened on both coasts.
Yep. And when they start expanding courses, when they start introducing comparative zoology and immunology, it's within 2 years. And Woods Hole had the Marine Biological Laboratory has started with basically 2 courses, and then they quickly ramped it up into the physiology, immunology.
So you didn't mention Walter K. Fisher. He was the first director here.
Yeah, so I try to cover before we get here, and then that's a whole other story when we get here. Walter K. Fisher is the first director at Hopkins Marine Station, and he would truly be a director.
Yeah.
He was basically chained here. Couldn't leave. He's the only person here in terms of faculty for the first 10 years. And then Heath and Skogsberg come along. And then
Heath must have been pretty early on.
Heath came fairly early on, and that was once he was granted the permission by Ray Lyman Wilbur to actually come. He's like, please, can I come to Hopkins? And he's like, okay, I'll let you go from main campus, and then you can come down. Then comes Bolin, and then comes Van Niel, right along in that order. And then comes Blinks. So that gets into our history here. And a big push, and I think Amanda's really starting to find this out, and she's come across this trove of information that we've just not taken into appreciation of all the oceanography and all the surveys that we have data sets for that are in the library. And she's starting to pull this story together to me, and she's coming up in I'm like, oh, that's another interesting piece of the story of what happens when we arrive here.
So this was Fisher's building, and the Lerbe building was Van Niel's building.
There's quite a story on that, too, if you want to listen to it. Right, so when they're going to build that building over there, it's not for Stanford University. It's meant, when Rockefeller Foundation is going to give that money, it's meant to be shared. This was going to be the meeting place for all kinds of scientists. So we go back to Hopkins Seaside Laboratory, who was this meeting place for everybody to come. They're seeing this on the foundation level. So they're trying to work it out where they'll just build a second building, right? This one would be one laboratory, and this would be another one, not totally associated with Stanford University, but evidently a story that's told by Jacques Lerbe's son, Leonard Lerbe, hints that Kofoid, who's a professor at Berkeley, he causes a ruckus at one of the meetings where it's all supposed to go down and run smoothly, and I think Berkeley pulls out, and then the foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, says, okay, Stanford University, it's yours. We're going to build this building for you. It's going to be the physiology building. And they build that building and just stack it full of experimental equipment for physiology studies. And Van Niel comes here, and there's hardly anybody else in that building, and he's got all this technology to himself. And it starts getting used a little bit more and on. But there was a little bit of tough getting going with the LURB building and the research that was going to go on there. All in the meantime, natural history is still going on. Ecology is being ramped up. It starts getting ramped up early. 1919, 1920, Fisher's using the term ecology in his course lectures. As you see it move on, McGinnity comes here, George McGinnity. He does his master's degree with his wife Nettie. They are teaching the next course of marine ecology by 1928, 29. Ricketts is here about that time. Ricketts and McGinnity's are really good friends. But McGinnity's going to move on. He's going to go down to this other laboratory, Kirchhoff Laboratory, and be director there. So you know who they trained to be the next instructor of the marine ecology course is Bolin. And Bolin teaches marine invertebrate ecology, basically, I believe, uses between Pacific tides for probably the next 30 years, but we never recognized it. He was totally right there all the time, and we always think of him as an ichthyologist studying fishes. But Bolin's another very interesting story, and the whole early history of marine ecology taking place here, what studies are happening, the Hewitt transect. It's a bit of this whole story. So now I've gone from 1880 with you, right? Zoology with a microscope at a bunch of tents, because that's all that was at that Chautauqua in 1880. Marine botany by Dr. C.L. Anderson, who would come down for 26 years, who was a medical doctor at Santa Cruz, all the way up to now we're talking Bolin, Van Niel, the building of the LURB building, the building of the Agassiz building. There's a lot of history here, and this is just a curmudgeon of it. Crumb. Any other questions?
When was Agassiz inaugurated? Was it in February 18?
When was the Agassiz named?
No, just started to be used for research or teaching.
Oh, I think it's 1918. That's the first summer course. Yeah, and they weren't done until early January 1918. They probably finished with it to move in. So if you look at that picture, there's September. That looks like it was when they had got the building for earthquake proof. There's September again. And they're just tearing down the old building. It's the last summer session over at Hopkins Seaside. So they're going to come back over here and get everything going again. Summer sessions would only happen first. And then it'd be about 10 more years, and then they would start doing the spring sessions here at Hopkins Seaside.
Who paid for this building?
Stanford University. I think I have it.
Stanford?
The plans of the new building, which are cost approximately $25,000. Working space and facilities of character, developmental biology, biological work, Monterey Bay.
Wow, that's quite an investment for them.
$25,000. And so that's 1918. 8 years later, Rockefeller gives $100,000. But I think Stanford has to match with another $100,000.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, so we're only talking 8 years later, and we're going to go from a $25,000 building to a $200,000 building. So I hadn't even thought about that.
No, it's not 8. It was 1929 or that.
All right, so it's 11 years. Well, it was finished, right? It was finished, so they start all this whole process. That's why I say 26, 27, they're still going through the process. So thanks for coming. That's it in a nutshell. You know where to go if you have insomnia, right? They'll put you to sleep.